Hey everyone, welcome to our Organizing for Waste Justice gathering. This is the second installment in our three-part event series to launch the Zero Waste Masterplan. And today we are also celebrating the launch of the Master Plan's companion guide for organizers, which Denise, it would be great if you could pop that in the chat. It is now on our landing page on the original Zero Waste Master Plan website, and we're really excited to share this all with you guys. We'll get started in just another minute. All right, so thank you for being present today. I'm really excited for this panel. Our amazing panelists are going to be here discussing the campaigns that they have led at the intersections of waste management and community empowerment, fair development, labor rights, health, movement building, and racial justice. A little bit more about GAIA. GAIA is a global network of more than 800 grassroots groups, NGOs, and individuals. We envision a just, zero waste world built on respect for ecological limits and community rights, where people are free from the burden of toxic pollution and resources are sustainably conserved, not dumped or burned. We work to catalyze a global shift towards environmental justice by strengthening grassroots social movements that advance solutions to waste and pollution. A little bit more about the structure of this evening. We're going to go for 1 hour. I'm going to spend some time introducing you to our brand new companion guide for organizers before asking the panelists their opening question. After that, we'll be spending the second half of this gathering answering audience questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. We won't be pulling questions from the chat box, so please be sure to put them in the right place. If people have any technical trouble, they can connect with support through the chat box. Our staff will be monitoring things there. So now on to our speakers. So I'm going to be moderating. My name is Adi, and I am the Zero Waste Communities Coordinator here at GAIA, based in New York City. Then we have Katie Andreski, who is Breathe Free Detroit's campaign organizer. She is a seasoned activist who had lived in the shadow of the Detroit incinerator for over a decade. She works to educate and uplift her community by carrying out public engagement, public education, and community action campaigns. Katie spent the previous years of her career teaching in Detroit's urban farms and school gardens, reinforcing a sense of self-reliance, community engagement, and lessons from nature. She also founded the People's Organization Against Incineration in 2008, and in 2011 hosted artists at the US Social Forum who created sunflower protest signs at the Yes Farm, her community art and agriculture space. KT brings deep-seated environmental consciousness and creativity to her passion for growing a healthy and equitable Detroit. Then we have Nasir Khan, who is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Originally from Brooklyn, New York, with roots in Kerala and Uttar Pradesh in India, Nasir has spent the last 5 years in Minnesota. He is the co-founder of the Minneapolis Black, Indigenous, and People of Color Climate Environmental Justice Table. He has had a variety of roles in climate and environmental justice movements, including with Minnesota 350 and People's Climate Movement in Minnesota. Before that, he worked for the labor union SEIU for several years, organizing university, fast food, and healthcare workers. Earlier in his life, he was involved with HIV/AIDS treatment and prevention work in several countries in the global south, mostly working for community-based organizations and movements. Then we have John Bouchard, who is based in the San Francisco Bay Area. John has been a union member working in the solid waste and recycling industry since 1998, starting as a sorter in a transfer station and eventually becoming a curbside collection driver. He remained in that position until 2013, where he was hired as a business rep for Teamsters Local 350, which represents 2,500 solid waste and recycling workers in San Francisco, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Benito counties. In addition to serving as a business representative, John has served on the executive board as a recording secretary president, his current role as secretary, treasurer, and principal officer. He also serves as an executive board member for the San Mateo County Central Labor Council, San Mateo County Union Community Alliance, and as a commissioner on the California Statewide Commission on Recycling Markets and Curbside Recycling. He and his wife Susie were both born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area and have been married for 23 years. They have two amazing daughters who are both currently attending college. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really excited to hear from you. Now, a little bit about the Zero Waste Master Plan. Some of you may have attended our launch event 2 weeks ago. The Zero Waste Master Plan is a tool to help you and decision makers understand what is and is not zero waste, get you through the nuts and bolts of developing a zero waste plan, and explore a menu of common sense implementation options that are grounded in social and environmental justice. Now, we've written this companion guide to help organizers mobilize around the Zero Waste Master Plan to advance zero waste campaigns in their communities. Working on, a zero waste campaign can be daunting. We're going up against some powerful forces, and it involves imagining a future that none of us have experienced yet. However, the grassroots movement for zero waste is already in motion. And this companion guide contains sample outreach tactics and agendas for community zero waste meetings, guidance on developing relationships with unions and local governments, and tips for building coalitions and creating campaign strategy. And all of this is drawn from the expertise and experience of our GAIA global network, people who have already been doing this work and are willing to share their takeaways to grow this zero waste movement. So on to our opening question for our speakers. KT will go first, following by Nasir and then John. It would be great if you could all tell us a little bit about what you do and how your zero waste work converges with your other organizing and advocacy priorities. And you'll have 6 minutes each. KT, if you would like to go.
Thank you for hosting this panel and putting together this amazing resource guide for all these cities across the United States. So I'm here in Detroit. I'm the campaign organizer for Breathe Free Detroit, and we were the campaign that was leading the shutdown of the Detroit incinerator. We had a successful campaign. This incinerator shut down in March of 2019. Different organizations were fighting for it to shut down for 33 years, and Detroit had a lot of problems not being able to have a very vibrant recycling program because the incinerator actually relied on recyclables as fuel. So once the incinerator shut down, even though there was a lot of work done to get curbside recycling up and running, there was only around 20% of curbside recycling available to the homeowners. And we're still increasing recycling here. As a campaign, once the incinerator shut down, we were first most concerned about the workers and where they were going. We found out the day the incinerator shut down, the same time, around the same time that the workers found out. So it was a very horrible system for to not tell anybody that you're not going to have a job the next day. And so we were working to try to figure out different places for the workers to be absorbed into. If we had a very vibrant recycling and composting and zero waste system here in Detroit, we would have been able to easily absorb these workers. And since then, we have adjusted our campaign from fully working to shut down the Detroit incinerator to the just transition work around the workers, a just transition around the residents that live around this polluting facility, and a just transition for our waste now that the waste that we create here in Detroit and all of the waste that was coming to the incinerator from many different cities is now going to a landfill, which is not what our campaign was supporting in the first place, because it's also not a great option. So one of the more unique things that we're doing here is we have a lot of strength in the just transition for our residents. So we've created a resource guide that is a compilation of all of these amazing resources that the city, state, and county and nonprofits, organizations, there's over 22 different organizations in this packet, and we just compiled all of the resources together in one place because they took months to find, and there's resources there for utility assistance and tax assistance, foreclosure assistance, legal assistance, and more. It's pretty much a guide to help Detroiters stay in their homes, because when a polluting facility, if it's an incinerator or pretty much any polluting facility, shuts down and the air becomes clean, most of the time the people that have experienced the worst of that pollution are then pushed and forced out of their home for new development to come in. So our campaign is doing this very important work to increase land ownership from these community members, to make sure that our neighbors are able to stay in their homes, that these businesses can stay, that we have a strong voice to lead the change that this community is ultimately already seeing. And then for the zero waste work that we're doing, we work a lot closer now with the Green Task Force, which is it's a committee that is put together by a council member here in Detroit, and it's made up of many different areas. So there's a Green Task Force Committee for Recycling and Composting that I'm on, and it pretty much is a place that brings together people who have the passion to work in many different areas, from urban farmers to policymakers to city leaders, and we come together to create policy and ordinances and submit them to Councilman Benson, who is in charge of this Green Task Force, and he brings it back to the city council whole and the Detroit mayor, so that we can actually make these changes happen in a more collaborative way and make the changes from the community voices first. So.
Great, thanks so much, Katie. And just like as a quick follow-up question for you, I know that art has played a really big role in your organizing. And so it'd be great if you could, since you have some time left, expand a little bit about, what organizing and art and zero waste, sort of how they come together in your work as Free Detroit.
Yeah, I have an art background, so it's hard for me to escape that. And when I moved here, I realized that there's so many folks that don't have the time to really put the images together for the fights that they're making. Like if you're a farmer, you don't have the time to stand up for what's right on your farm to make sure that it's sustainable. If you're a worker and you're a single mother, like there's so many things that people have no time to fight for. The artists have this time, and they're able to put together words in such a creative way and such a concise way that can get the visions out that the people have for their own communities in such a beautiful manner. Like even behind me, I have posters made from Amos Kennedy. He's an amazing printmaker, and there's an incredible amount of artists that are here in Detroit that support the movements. Having art in protests, having art inspire the changes that we want to see, and actually present those types of changes in visual forms can really create a big difference. The Yes Farm, when we were operating it back in the day during the US Social Forum, had we had the grace of Mona Caron's presence, who's this amazing muralist, and she came out here and worked directly with community and showed us so much of how to bring our voices out and put them onto very creative signs. And art really just brings together so many more people, and it just brings the whole movement and the voices of the movement to life. And that includes music as well, and poetry, not just any form of like 2D and 3D art. So even dance can be a form of protest. I've realized that many times. So it's a great tool to use.
That's awesome. Yeah, art is such an important part of campaign work, and making this work feel relevant and personal and immediate in ways that speak to people's emotions. So thank you for sharing that. Nasir, would you like to go next? We'll have 6 minutes.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet all of you, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about our work here in Minnesota. Yeah, a little about us. So we are pretty new. We've been around for a couple of years now, and basically a bunch of organizers who are really coming out of environmental justice struggles, from whether shutting down a pipeline that was transporting tar sands oil from Alberta to terminal on Lake Superior that would then go to the rest of the world, called Line 3, fighting the incinerator that is in North Minneapolis, where Black folks have been segregated for decades to here, and a variety of other issues. Just seeing, like, I think a few things that really are like sort of the DNA of our organization, that, it was the environmental justice movement here is like pretty, like, as it is all over the country and world, like under-resourced relative to the larger environmental movement, pretty disempowered. Like, there was a statewide 100% bill that initially was treating incineration as something bad and not, wasn't renewable energy. And then under pressure, the governor intervened and basically made incineration a good thing again. That was like, it's renewable, like we have no other way to deal with trash. And so we saw, there's a lot of progressive sounding folks and climate organizations involved in that coalition, and just saw from there how like, even in a thing that seemed pretty obvious that people were on board with, how like our movement gets, left in the dust when other priorities are present. And so really wanting to build power to change that. And so also coming out of working in the climate movement and in the labor movement, and seeing that, often the environmental movement is like not really a movement of people, feels like sometimes, but of like policies and legislation and sign-on letters, and wanting to like turn it in, like really like build people power, and also build power in communities that have historically been dumped on, because that, I think we're pretty committed to the root causes of things, not just like how they manifest. So like the fact that there's an incinerator in the part of the state that has the highest asthma hospitalization rate in the state, that's where the Black population has been segregated to is not an accident. It's intentional. It's it's partly due to the relative lack of power of that community. So we're really not, we are trying to build something that's long-term, and that lasts beyond any one campaign or any one issue. And that also means like, it's not just about, so what we've been focusing on, and like what I'm going to be speaking to is, we're trying to shut down this incinerator in North Minneapolis, which has been a long-standing fight, just like in Detroit for almost 30 years now. People have been trying to shut it down, various groups. And so, yeah, we're really like, and we have some of those folks involved who've been leading the fight for years now, but we are not just trying to shut it down. We also know from like previous experience that when people go to the owner of the incinerator, which is the county that Minneapolis is located in, Hennepin County, they're told, first of all, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, that like incineration is the best way to deal with trash. It's better than landfilling. Zero waste is actually in the county plan, but it's like very little is done with it. And so when people go, they're like demanding that the incinerator gets shut down. They're told it's impossible, that this is the best way. This is the only practical way we have to deal with trash, that it's safe, that it's, it's like filtering all the chemicals out. And we know those things are not true. But also, like, I think the strategy has been to adopt zero waste as, instead of going and just asking for something to be shut down, to also propose the solution, so that they can't turn to us and say, well, we can't do anything. Because when they do that, what we are building towards is, laying down the policy and saying, this is how you do it. This is the plan. And the ideal, and this is like also like a really important part of how we work, is that it should be led by the community. It should be led by Black, Indigenous, people of color folks, working class folks, the ones who are impacted in that environmental justice community. And so, for example, to see, students from North High School who, look, the plan is to have folks really move towards zero waste in that area, so that it's those actual community members saying, we've managed to move to zero waste in our high school. Why is it that the county can't do it? Especially when the reality is that a lot of the suburbs around Minneapolis send their trash to this incinerator to be burnt. And those are some of the richest suburbs in the country, like Eden Prairie and Edina. And so how is it that these suburbs that have so much wealth, that have actually a lot of people who claim to be zero waste, are sending their trash here, and like a little, under-resourced high school can like move to zero waste and set the example? So that's kind of like, I think some of the plan, and just, maybe a bit about, if I'm not over time, I think I'm very close to time, so I'll stop. But yeah, thanks.
You're right on time. Thanks, Nasir. That's really important. I think like making that distinction that like zero waste is not this like boutique lifestyle option for wealthy white suburban people. It's actually life or death for folks. So yeah, thanks for going into that, and thanks for drawing light to the whole power building element as well. You're not just advocating for specific policies, you're advocating for marginalized people to take power and hold power. And before we move on to John, I just want to remind everyone really quickly that feel free to put in any questions you have for the panelists as a whole, or for specific panelists, into the Q&A. And yeah, John, it's your turn, and you will have 6 minutes.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me on. I'm really honored and grateful that you asked me to be part of this discussion. So zero waste is obviously, kind of close to my heart here, because of the folks that we represent. Teamsters Local 350 is unique in that we're what's considered a craft local. Meaning we only represent, primarily one type of industry. We represent workers all the way through the waste and recycling industry, from sorters to drivers, even the clerical workers that work in a lot of these companies, hazardous waste folks, mechanics that work on the vehicles. So, wall to wall. And obviously zero waste, the goal of zero waste at its root is to divert material from the landfills, or it sounds like we don't have incinerators here in California, but it sounds like in other parts of the country to divert away from incineration, but which is a good idea. But also we have to look at what's happening to those recyclables that are being diverted, because a lot of them are being sold to other countries. Before, a lot of it was sold to China until China stopped buying. And then, these processors had to find other buyers in Southeast Asia. But there's very little thought about what's happening to the material once it reaches those other locations. In Southeast Asia, for example, it's primarily incinerated. So, and it's impacting, much like in the United States, it impacts lower income people and communities more severely than other communities. And, that's the case here in the United States as well, and here in the Bay Area. Most of the pollutants most of the facilities that produce pollutants are in lower income communities and communities that are primarily people of color. And it's important that while we focus on zero waste, we're also being cognizant of how that's impacting these communities, and recognizing that zero waste is not only for environmental issues, but if you expand that and look at the big picture, you also look at how a zero waste goal can help improve the lives of people of color and in the lower income communities. And like I said, there's oil in the Bay Area. Oil refineries are in the Richmond area, which are produce pollutants, and the Richmond area is primarily lower income and people of color. Factories, you have methane from cattle farms, and also you have to look at how climate change is affecting lower income people. I mean, when you have hurricanes in Louisiana or in the South and the Gulf, they're not impacting people, affluent people, the same way they're impacting lower income people, and that's those are kind of nuanced, and as you stated, Adi, early on, that we're up against very powerful organizations and corporations that don't want to admit that this is the case, but the fact of the matter is it's true. The other benefit to zero waste goals is the job creation part of it. These, as I mentioned, a lot of these facilities are in lower income communities. Like here in San Francisco, there's a material recovery facility called Pier 96. And when Recology wanted to open Pier 96, the city required that they hire from within the community that it was built. So you have, over 150 jobs that were created in this facility. And these jobs were available only to the folks that lived in the zip codes that were in this area. So job creation is huge as well. And from a union perspective, it's important that we are electing politicians that are environmentally friendly and labor friendly, so that they are cognizant of all this and they understand the core issues, but they also understand the bigger picture and how these core issues impact people in different communities, and that it's all connected and tied together.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And we'll be taking questions from here and from Facebook. We're also posting this on Facebook Live. One question for John, following up on what you were saying. Could you tell us a little bit more about how working in the waste sector impacts worker safety and health, and how can we briefly, as we build a zero waste system, ensure that worker protections are baked into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of these collection and processing contracts, they, obviously the municipalities put these contracts out to bid. The various companies will bid on them. And it's important that when these contracts are put out for bid, it's important to ensure that the contracts include language that requires labor peace, prevailing wage requirements, job retention, because you can't just come in and have, these garbage and recycling contracts are very lucrative, and these companies get reimbursed by the municipalities to perform the work. So you can't come in and just have, minimum wage jobs, because in most cases, the minimum wage is far below the actual living wage, especially here in the Bay Area. I mean, the cost of living is crazy here. So the minimum wage just isn't going to allow someone to support their family. Even the living wage, it's arguable that it should be even called a living wage, because it's so difficult to get by here with the cost of real estate. And so I think it's important that you do the political work as an organization. And that's why it's important. That's why I think unions are important, because it gives voice and power to the workers. The workers as individuals may not have a lot of power, and they may not have a very strong, loud voice, but when they work collectively with the help of a union and with the members helping the union, you have a much stronger voice. The politicians are much more responsive to you. And, look, at least here in the Bay Area, all these politicians want endorsements from labor unions. And, it's really up to us to make them earn those endorsements by addressing all the concerns that KT and Nasir were all bringing up in this conversation. It has to be, politicians have to understand that when you have gender equality, income equality, that's better for the entire society, because if I'm making more money locally, that's going to allow me, one, to live in the area where I work, right, which is going to reduce carbon footprint. It also means I'm going to take my money that I'm earning and I'm going to put it back into the community where I live. And when my community is doing well economically, then my city's doing well. That means my county's going to do better. My county's doing better. That means my state's going to do better. So it's, as I said, it's a lot for people to put together when they don't come from this background, but it's very important that we make sure that the workers are taken care of in the zero waste realm, and they complement each other. Zero waste goals help with labor, help with economy, help with social justice issues, and vice versa.
Well put. Thanks so much, John. One follow-up question for Nasir. Nazir, you've worked with SEIU, and I know you've done some work with janitorial workers, and it would be great to hear a bit more about how service workers are creating better waste systems in their workplaces, and how environmental advocates can build solidarity with service workers.
Yeah, it's a good follow-up, I think, because it really builds off of what John was just saying. So there's the SEIU janitors union here, which is called SEIU Local 26, which is kind of like that analog to 32 BJ on the coast, if folks are familiar. Their contract was up at the start of this year, and for a variety of reasons, one of which I'll get into, they decided to introduce a green demand, which was basically there are two components to it. One was a training program for their janitors to learn like energy efficiency practices and these are janitors who clean primarily, they have other units, but it's mainly like downtown office buildings. And these downtown office buildings are, by the way, huge contributors to carbon emissions in the state. Like I think it's, don't quote me on this, but it's like 30% of Minnesota's carbon comes from downtown office buildings. And so that there's that, and then also improving waste management practices, so moving towards zero waste. And so there's a training fund was one. The other was a table to meet with building owners to move them more effectively towards zero waste and towards better energy efficiency. And yeah, so we basically threw down with them with a lot of other climate organizations and convinced them to take on the incinerator as an issue to bring that in. And there's a report that we all put together, which I'll share, which is kind of, it's a good sort of like summary of what we all did. Yeah, they took it on, and it was important because the waste from these buildings goes to that incinerator in North Minneapolis, where also a lot of union members live, and so their children, they're breathing it in. But it also, what was really interesting is kind of what John was like alluding to, I feel like, was it gave workers like a moral like leadership at the bargaining table. Like instead of, just being sort of like, just, working class janitors who they're there just to like get their pay and that's it. Like they were talking about like the injustice of sending this trash when it could have been much better, much more effectively dealt with into like this community that has, like pretty bad health outcomes. And that gave them, it wasn't just moral leadership, it was also like, it was power at the bargaining table because they had leverage, like that this company was doing this was like, looks bad for the contractors who clean the buildings and for the buildings themselves who have all these, they talk a lot, there's a lot of greenwashing that goes on. They talk about sustainability. A lot of the companies inside the buildings are all about it, but then like don't take care of their trash. And so that was really it. So they eventually won. And yeah, we are like in the midst of creating this training program now. And yeah, I think like one thing also, the one point I wanted to bring up was that one of the reasons they took on this demand was because they have a lot of Latinx members who have had to leave, Central America because of climate change. And I mean, it's one of the most, I think, incredible things I've seen as a climate organizer was, this is not like, it wasn't a broadly understood thing in the membership that people were climate refugees. It started with, people just knew they had to leave. But it started with a few members who, when they realized that, and it took some political education to get there, it just spread like wildfire through the union. And it became something that then people also tied this climate injustice with environmental injustice, and realized that like the trash that is being burned in the incinerator is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions that are affecting their families back home, and were part of the reason why they had to leave. And it was this really incredible like moment of like, regular folks taking moral leadership, and then having the militancy and the numbers that, we had this, they actually had a strike authorization vote, and we convened a meeting with like a lot of climate allies just before the vote. And then people saw, like literally 600 people, the very different energy than I think folks are used to in the environmental movement, like deciding they were going to fight for this, they're going to fight for doing something about climate change, environmental injustice. And yeah, it was, I think, a pretty transformative moment for a lot of the folks in the climate movement too.
That's really inspiring. I mean, that kind of framing, that kind of alliance building and mutual support is exactly what we need to win. So it's really awesome that something like that is, happening in Minneapolis. So thanks for sharing that. One follow-up question for KT. KT, I would love to know, and I think, we could all learn from you, and what are some things that you wish you had known when starting out your zero waste campaign?
Yeah, so I wish I would have known that the incinerator wasn't going to provide any heads up to the workers. if we knew that they had no stake in supporting their workers' future, we would have done a lot more work in that area. We were working mostly with the environmental injustice and the environmental racism that was going on within the communities directly surrounding the incinerator, which, similar to Minneapolis, it was the highest asthma rates around this incinerator in all of Michigan. There's so much devastation of communities that were around this incinerator. A lot of homes ended up just being abandoned and burning down, and there's a lot of vacant land. One of the things that we're looking into right now is increasing land ownership from community members, and also increasing land ownership as a larger entity, and looking into community land trusts. This land, when the incinerator was operating, averaged about $100 to $500 per lot. Sorry, San Francisco. But and now the land that that's around the incinerator, some of it went from $500 a lot to $5,000 a lot within the year of this incinerator being closed. So I would say that one of the biggest lessons is that in our work of empowering the community to stand up for the right to breathe clean air, we could have done so much more work, so much more impactful work by securing this land. Just being hopeful that the incinerator will be shut down eventually. It's a lot more difficult right now, but we're making it happen. We have, I think there's over 8 community members right now that have put in proposals to the city for large green space projects. A lot of people didn't even know that the land next to their house was available to them. There's so much lack of information and outreach from the city here in Detroit. So we're really just trying to do a lot of those types of connections. If we had a vibrant, as I said earlier, if we had a vibrant zero waste system in Detroit, it would have easily absorbed all of those workers. If we were, citywide composting, citywide recycling, had spaces for that, fix-it spaces, and returnables spaces and businesses, it would have been able to provide all the jobs, or all the people who had lost jobs, new positions.
Great, thank you for that insight, KT. And following up on that, one question for John. What advice would you give to community organizers like KT who want to make sure that labor considerations are accounted for when organizing a zero waste campaign?
I think partnering with unions is important, and I think that goes both ways. As a union, one of the things that we've been trying to focus on is partnering with social justice groups, so that there's an intersection and we're working towards the same goals. So, I think it would be great if these organizations were able to recognize that there is an intersection and try to figure out collectively how we can improve the situation, both for the environmental goals and the labor goals. And that includes different unions working together as well, because Nasir's story about working with the janitors, we have a SEIU local out here run by Olga Miranda, Local 87, and it's all the janitors in San Francisco. And we had a San Francisco County Supervisor, Asha Safai, who pushed an amendment to legislation that required on-site sorting for some of these large refuse producers downtown, these huge buildings. And we got a lot of pushback from the building owner associations, and even from other unions who thought I was crazy for signing off on it because they thought it would reduce work for my members, which it's done. We've supported it, It hasn't affected our members in any way whatsoever. It's created more jobs for the janitors union, and it's getting us closer to that zero waste goal. So I think building relationships with different organizations that you maybe normally would not work with, not because you refuse to, but just because you're not aware. I think that's a good first step.
Awesome. Thanks so much, John. And then one question for each of the three panelists in the same order that we started in. Very briefly, I would love to know what's something that gives you hope as far as like what brings you hope insofar as us building a just and resilient zero waste future together. These are dark times, and I think we could all use something to sort of, guide us through this.
I'm sorry, is that for me?
So all three of you.
Oh,
so
okay.
Katie, then Nasir, then John.
Okay.
So one thing that gave me hope throughout the fight to shut down the incinerator was how many community members were so passionate at seeing a different future. These folks and they're all my neighbors, were recycling and composting as an act of resistance while the incinerator was operating. They were some of the folks that were really doing some of the greatest work, because they knew that they didn't want to breathe in the trash that they could then recycle or compost. So one of the areas that I'm hopeful still now is that these folks are not only leading in zero waste efforts here in the city, within their own communities, but are also leading in the community-led power efforts to really take the neighborhoods around this incinerator and uplift everybody's voices now that they're so excited that their air is a lot cleaner and see a better future for generations.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Nasir?
I think here, just seeing how like folks came across the movement together, from labor to like the youth climates, a lot of youth folks, a lot of climate folks, some of whom I was pretty surprised about how they engaged in it, just like threw down, I think partly because of like the way, having like militant workers like push just like changes how people like what people think is possible even, and that like we were able to foreground like environmental and climate like issues with like all these other things, and it's happening right now. Like we've started to look at what's going to happen if the incinerator does get shut down to the land. Like it's likely going to get property values are going to skyrocket, people are going to get priced out, and yeah, like I think finding these like ways in which the environmental justice movement can really be like a multi-issue, like a movement that looks at root causes. It's not just about shutting an incinerator down, but about like our relationship to the land and like what happens to that land. So yeah, I think that like there's a depth, I feel like, to the what's building here that is, it's what we need, for like the crises that are in front of us. And I see, especially, I feel like youth, honestly, like getting that from the get-go and fighting in that way. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you, Nasir. And if you're more interested in learning more about the relationship between waste and land, you can check out the recording of the launch event that we had before this 2 weeks ago on YouTube, where one of our members, Shoshana Campbell with the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, really goes into that relationship between zero waste and community ownership of land, and something really interesting. And of course, KT is also working towards the eventual development of a community land trust over in Detroit. And yeah, over to you now, KT.
So I think there's a couple things that give me hope. One of which is just how active young people are and aware in our country. I know myself as a young person, I really was not consciously aware of environmental issues, social issues. And, you know, I have, as Adi mentioned in my bio, I have two daughters that are in college, and I've learned a lot from them over the years. And I'm not talking about now that they're in college, I'm talking about like when they were in middle school, and they're educating me on different issues. And so the young people in this country seem to be much more engaged and active now. So that gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope is I think labor unions are becoming conscious of how environmental issues impact labor, and kind of taking a step back and, you know, not only being concerned with, you know, retaining jobs and things like that, but also looking at, is there a way that we can responsibly address some of these issues and also retain jobs? I think that's important, where it's not, the door's not being slammed on environmental issues anymore. Everybody's taking everybody I think now realizes we have a moral and ethical obligation to take a closer look at these problems and try to come up with resolutions that can, you know, keep all sides happy.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think all of your answers really illustrate the way that we at GAIA approach zero waste, and that it's something that requires cooperation, coordination between multiple social, environmental, and economic justice movements in order for it to be successful. And something that isn't just a way to get trash out of landfills and incinerators, but rather a holistic tool of social intervention towards well-being for all. So thank you for really drawing upon your own experiences and leadership in this field to highlight that for our audience tonight. And real quickly, just to wrap up, I really encourage you guys all to check out the Zero Waste Master Plan and its companion guide for organizers. You can take a look at it over at zerowasteworld.org/ZWMP. We also have one final launch event happening next Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern, specifically for policymakers and elected officials and department staff. So if you have ever worked with someone in one of those positions or thinking about starting a zero waste campaign in your city and want to clue some folks in your city in, please send them this information. You can register at tinyurl.com/ZWNP and that link is also over at the Zero Waste Masterplan landing page, which if you flip over to the next slide, Claire, zerowasteworld.org/ZWMP. There you can look at the master plan, its companion guide. You can sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on the state of zero waste and anti-incineration efforts in the United States and Canada. And you can also register for that upcoming salon event for city policymakers. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you so much to our incredible panelists. We'll be sending out an email to follow up with all of this information and all of the links that we discussed. So everyone have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone. Nice to meet all of you.
Yeah, thank you for all your great work.